Shalom, everyone. I'm Rabbi Steve Moskowitz of Congregation Lador Vador here on Long Island. We're very excited that people are joining us here on Zoom and also on our YouTube channel and Congregation's Facebook page. So we're going to be learning from Ron Jager, who's gracious enough to be up in the middle of the morning there in Israel at 2 a.m. his time. So that we could schedule this at a convenient time for ourselves. So thank you, Ron, first of all, for pulling an all-nighter on our behalf. We appreciate that. So this program is sponsored by our congregation's Enrichment Committee, and I'm going to turn it over to Judy Hirschon, who's going to formally introduce our speaker. And we're looking forward to learning from him, and he's going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then, of course, we'll open it up for questions and answers and discussion.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Rabbi. So welcome, everyone. And thank you for joining us. And special thanks to Rabbi Moskowitz for helping to organize tonight's event with our old friend, Ron Jager, whom I first met February 2017 when he'd been invited to speak at Lador Vador. And since that time, Ron and I had been meeting whenever he visited Long Island until COVID intervened. And I'm particularly pleased to see him on Zoom, and hopefully he will soon be in New York. So Ron grew up in the South Bronx of New York City, making Aliyah to Israel in 1980. Major Jager was commander of the Central Psychiatric Clinic for reserve soldiers at Tel Hashomer. Since retiring, he's been involved in strategic consultancy to NGOs and communities in the Gaza Envelope on resiliency projects to assist first responders. Given the war and Ron's unique background, I had thought would be interesting to hear his insights, and we are most grateful to have him speaking to us from Israel, where, as the rabbi mentioned, I believe it's now past 2 a.m. So, Ron, many, many thanks. In his talk, there are a few issues in particular about which I'd like Ron to comment. While Israelis are deeply grateful for the support coming from the U.S., a good deal of pressure is now being brought not only to end the war prematurely, but provide a plan for the day after, when there should be no talk at this time until the outcome of the war is better understood. And just last month, General David Petraeus actually spoke at Lador Vador and had commented on this issue, stating, in his opinion, the IDF would have to remain in Gaza for the foreseeable post-war period. And furthermore, the reality is miles of underground tunnels, which will remain undestroyed, where Hamas and Islamic Jihad terrorists can emerge, as well as having terrorists circulating in civilian dress. So these threats are there. But meanwhile, the Biden administration has been pushing for some sort of two-state solution with some sort of reconstituted PA, which is difficult to imagine given the situation in Judea and Samaria, where Hamas has been allowed to take control. And the reality is the PA is in no position to take over. We know the majority of Israelis will not accept a deal with the two-state solution, and the PLO itself states their goal is to annihilate the state of Israel. In the last year alone, there have been 5,000 Palestinian attacks and 3,000 terrorists apprehended since October 7th. To quote one military expert, from his point of view, it appears difficult for the Israeli left to accept a reality where its entire vision for the future has entirely backfired. Would also like to hear comment on recent pointing of fingers by the U.S. State Department at 4 settlers, none of whom have been found guilty by any court of law, while 95% of Arabs support October 7th, and violence has been erupting across the region, including locating missiles in Judea and Samaria, which have been traced to Afghanistan, left by the U.S. military. It's a great pleasure to have Ron with us to discuss all these issues.
Hi, everybody. Shalom from Israel. Before I begin, I want to thank Rabbi Moskowitz and the others that are involved in tonight's meeting. Talia Smilowitz, Jen Armis, Martin Nidell, Marcia Glick, and Ginny Kunkin for the opportunity to speak this evening. And of course, I want to thank Judith who has been a friend over the years and connected me to your congregation. This lecture was originally scheduled before October 7th, and my talk was going to focus on the judicial reform and how it's being played out in Israel over the past year. But my focus tonight will be on the war, and towards the end, I will touch on the connection between the judicial reform and the anti-war and anti-government demonstrations that have been picking up steam over the past 3 weeks. But beforehand, a few words on my personal background. I grew up in the South Bronx, working in a working class family of Holocaust survivors. I lived on the Grand Concourse, which is by the Yankee Stadium area. The neighborhood was a violent environment for a white Jewish boy, a lot of street and school violence, and yet I managed to reach my first semester at Taft High School before my family moved to Bayside, Queens. I'm a graduate of the New York City public school system. Upon completing my MSW at Yeshiva University, I made the move to Israel on my own with a guitar and a backpack. Almost immediately after arriving to Israel, within a month, I was inducted into the Army in the Medical Corps. During my 25 years of military service, my expertise was in PTSD, war-related, and I spent a full 2 years in Lebanon during the first Lebanon War, one of which was in the Shuf Mountains above Beirut in 1984. Afterwards, about 6 years in frontline units in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and completed my service as commander of the Central Psychiatric Clinic for reserve soldiers at Tel Hashomer. I was the first clinical social worker to command the position, usually held by a psychiatrist. During my military service, I married Nitza, who was born and raised in Israel. I have 4 children and 10 grandchildren. 2 children have done PhDs, one in counterterrorism, and my daughter completed her PhD in a field that's probably close to your heart, 19th century Germany and the origins of the Reform movement. I was brought up like most American Jews, was not particularly religious, yet after marrying Nitza, she decided that we should give it a try. My second son, Avram, the counterterrorism expert, is very, very much not religious. So from my own personal background, I've experienced both sides of the religious aisle. Today, I am part of the Dati Leumi greater community, live in a small community just over the Green Line in Judea and Samaria, which it's only 18-minute drive to Tel Aviv, so if you can imagine, there's distances here. And to be honest, Ben Gvir, who we probably heard a lot about in the news, is not my cup of tea, but he has supporters and they voted him in, and that's undeniable. When I arrived in Israel, I felt like many Americans of my generation. We all remember the motto, make love, not war. Yet over the 43 years that I'm here in Israel, my personal understanding of the reality here in Israel and for Jews throughout the world has evolved and changed tremendously. Let's start. Let's talk about the geopolitical reality of the war and the propaganda war, which can also be labeled psychological warfare against Israel and American Jewry for that matter. Israel today, irrespective of one's political orientation, is overwhelmingly united. I cannot understate the unity that has swept the nation since October 7th. For those of you who get their Israeli news from Haaretz, the Times of Israel, the Jerusalem Post, I'm sorry to say you're getting a very skewed understanding of what's happening in Israel. To a large extent, they claim Israel is losing the war against Hamas, the war is unwinnable, the nation is divided. All not true. Only this morning, today, a big headline in Haaretz, we're no better than Hamas. Haaretz pulled out the controversial headline almost immediately after backlash from readers who saw the headline quickly enough denounced the newspaper for equating Israel to Hamas. This was only this morning. So there is a political consensus to create a new reality in which Hamas will no longer be a threat, not only to communities within the Gaza Envelope, meaning all the towns, kibbutzim, and moshavim surrounding the Gaza Strip, but also will not be a threat to all of Israel. That is, Israel must destroy and dismantle Hamas. That is the expectation of the public. Despite reports in recent weeks, Israel has destroyed about 90% of Hamas's capabilities without the high level of mass casualties expected in urban warfare. John Spencer, probably the world's leader on urban warfare from West Point, has stated the following recently. Israel's war on Hamas will be studied throughout militaries in the world as Israel destroys a whole new type of battlefield with both above ground and underground offensive capabilities, all within an urban environment, and civilians used as human shields by Hamas. The integration of ground forces with air support in such a manner as to avoid as much as possible excessive civilian casualties. The death rate of civilians versus the amount of firepower is translated into statistic, and it is very low. In any future conflict, technology will not be enough, and one must maintain offensive ground forces, infantry, tanks, artillery, and engineering corps. I want to remind everybody that a few years back, Ehud Barak made a big thing about the IDF being smart and small. And as it turns out, smart and small did not solve any problem or did not prepare Israel or the IDF for what happened October 7th. Israel needs a large army and it needs large ground forces. The type of warfare in taking over the Gaza Strip has never been seen before. IDF troops that advance must discover and destroy offensive shafts one by one, tunnels one by one. Gaza has a landmass of 140 square miles and over 500 miles of underground tunnels and well over 1,000 offensive shafts hidden in hospitals, infirmaries, schools, UNRWA buildings, public buildings. Thousands of buildings and homes are connected to the underground infrastructure built by Hamas. The criticism level on Israel as to how she is fighting in the Gaza Strip, and I quote, I want to repeat this, the level of criticism by the world, the media, whoever, and I quote, are detached from reality. Okay, let's get back to where I left off. A little brief history. Missiles and rockets have been raining on Israel periodically since 2005, when Israel unilaterally withdrew all civilians and military from the Gaza Strip. This was called a disengagement. Israel has no choice but destroy and dismantle its capabilities of Hamas completely. Should Israel allow Hamas and its leadership to survive the war they instigated in October 7th, then Israel will face the same similar threat of October 7th on all fronts, from Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Judea and Samaria, West Bank, and also from within Israel. The Middle East does not tolerate weakness, and with Israel being a regional power, it must maintain its deterrence in the future. On October 7th, Israel was caught unprepared while a small army of 3,000 to 4,000 Hamas terrorists breached the border and invaded the communities and towns in the Gaza envelope. On October 7th, we witnessed a scale of attack only a few of us thought was possible and conveyed warnings that were ignored. What has been the response of the social media, broadcasted and printed outlets, voices from the streets here in America and in Europe? Denying to Jews the right to self-defense that is granted to everyone else. Israel is told it has a right to self-defense, and yet every conceivable means of self-defense amounts to a war crime. Israel is sternly warned not to reoccupy Gaza in the wake of the war, yet even after 2005, when Israel unilaterally withdrew all civilians and military from the Gaza Strip, there was no one there from Israel. Israel was still being accused of occupying Gaza even after it stopped occupying any part of it. Israel has been told not to blockade Gaza by depriving it of fuel, electricity, and other goods, even after it was accused for years of blocking Gaza when fuel, electricity, and other goods flowed freely into the Gaza Strip. Israel is expected to stop building or dismantle settlements in the West Bank for the sake of a Palestinian state, and then told that the kibbutzim and the moshavim and the small towns and communities in the Gaza Envelope, whose members were barbarically slaughtered on October 7th, were also settlements, even though they're within Israel proper. Israel has asked and demanded to give Palestinian civilians time to flee Gaza before its military campaign begins, and then denounced for creating a Nakba by forcing Palestinians to flee their homes. Israel is told that it must scrupulously abide by the laws of war, even as the wanton murder, rape, and kidnapping of Israelis is treated as a legitimate form of resistance by Hamas and the Palestinians. We are told that from the river to the sea is a call for the creation of a Palestinian state, without any mention that it is principally a call for the destruction of the state of Israel. We are told that we must hold Israel to a high moral standard because it's a democracy, and yet at the same time accused of being an apartheid state. Later down in the lecture, I will go into the whole accusations of apartheid, genocide, and ethnic cleansing. And then the greatest lie of all, that Israel, the victim of the greatest massacre in memory since the Holocaust, the proportional equivalent of 16 9/11s by American standards, an atrocity that would have been 10 or 100 times worse if the Hamas terrorists had been given the means and opportunity. In fact, Israel is accused of being the aggressor of the perpetrator. Essentially, what is being said about Israel is that we got what was coming to us. No matter what, Israel is guilty. Because Israel, like the Jew during the Nazi period, is guilty from birth. The only remedy for guilt from birth is death. The reaction to the murder of Jews is euphoria. When more Jews are killed, it is taken as evidence of the Jews getting what they deserve. Now, this is what October 7th means and what it symbolizes. What I will share with you in the next few minutes is a little difficult to hear, but it has to be said so that nobody has any questions of what really happened that day. We've heard many media reports that it didn't really happen. It's all been fabricated by Israel to justify destroying the Gaza Strip and Hamas. Okay, so please bear with me for the next few minutes. Hamas commanders had issued specific and sadistic orders to the terror squads to kill and kidnap as many Jews as possible. They also issued orders to rape, sodomize, and sexually mutilate the Israeli women they came across. Live babies were put in kitchen ovens and burned to death before their parents. Men and women and children were slaughtered while family members were forced to watch. Victims were burnt alive, beheaded, and mutilated. Underage girls were savaged, as were their mothers, before the eyes of other family members. Grandmothers, even those in wheelchairs, were molested and sodomized. The terrorists filmed their acts in gory snuff films to be shared on social media and streamed them live on their GoPro cameras. They took their human trophies back to Gaza to be violated, abused, and held for ransom. Images were broadcasted in real time, documenting the atrocities. Shani Luke, a German-Israeli 23-year-old who had been kidnapped at the rave concert, horribly assaulted, and then brought back to Gaza in the back of a pickup truck. Hamas terrorists sat on top of her twisted, half-naked, unconscious body as if she were a hunting trophy. There was also the soul-searching video of a 19-year-old Israeli woman beaten, her wrists and ankles sliced open, held out of a vehicle by heavily armed men, yelling, "God is great" in Arabic. Her light jeans were bloodied at the crotch, indicating that the girl had been gang raped and violated in ways that cannot be imagined. The accounts of barbaric atrocities from that day are bone-chilling. One girl, a witness to a gang rape, told investigators, "I saw the Palestinians bending her down, raping her, and simply passing her on to the next terrorist. They cut off her breast and played with it." I want to remind everyone that rape and sexual assault as a terror tactic in conflict is a war crime. The Geneva Convention specifies that women shall be specifically protected against any attack on their honor, in particular against rape or any form of indecent assault. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court states that rape, sexual slavery, forced pregnancy, or any other form of sexual violence is a crime against humanity. Many other international treaties and conventions demand that the global community must always safeguard women and girls, including and especially during armed conflict. But the world has been silent about these heinous Hamas crimes against girls and women. Where is the outrage at the rape of children? Children were raped on October 7th. Where is the outrage from Save the Children or UNICEF? Their only response has been silence. I want to remind everyone that in 2014, after Boko Haram terrorists kidnapped 276 schoolgirls in Nigeria, movie stars and politicians spearheaded the global outcry. Michelle Obama launched a social media campaign to bring back our girls. But the former First Lady has been nowhere to be seen since October 7th. Her silence has been deafening and unexcusable. The war in Hamas has directly affected Jews throughout the world, and it's important to understand the explosion of Jew hatred as a result of the war. I wrote an article a couple of years ago called Minding My Own Business, and so I'm going to call this part of the lecture Minding My Own Business and Redemptive Anti-Semitism. What do I mean by redemptive anti-Semitism, and what do I mean by minding my own business? In recent years, the overwhelming thinking has been, let's mind our own business. I'm talking about American Jews in general. Let's not go down into the subways. Let's keep off the streets of Manhattan. Let's not be too public and identifiable as Jews, and wait till it blows over. This mindset worked and has been a popular way of dealing with the public anti-Semitism of the past. But something has changed, and it's been hard to grasp this change without understanding the forces operating behind this change. On the positive side, you have what I call neoliberals such as Bill Maher, the writer, talk show host, and comedian who has stated only recently, and I quote him, "When they fired at Israel, it's a war. When Israel fires back, it's a war crime." Little crazy. Also, would Hamas do that? Would they give 4-hour pauses? No pausing for Hamas. The HBR star reminded the panel not to forget the Islamic fanaticism part of Hamas, because you're not supposed to talk about it anymore. Because if you do, even if it's realistic and it tells it the way it is, it becomes Islamophobic. But it's true, Maher explained. The people in Hamas who kill their own people think they're doing them a favor because they're becoming martyrs. He also rallied against the open letter signed by over 750 journalists, urging newsrooms to embrace terms like apartheid, genocide, to describe Israel's treatment of Palestinians. They couldn't be more pro-Hamas, Maher said. They said they want the newsroom to adopt words such as apartheid. I hear it all the time anyway, it's wrong. And I hear genocide, again wrong. Israel is not trying to commit genocide. The other side blatantly saying we would love to commit genocide on the Jews. I just want to go through a couple of statistics about the claim of genocide. Let me just get it for a second. Here it is. The claim that Israel is doing genocide, apartheid, and ethnic cleansing could be easily discounted by looking at statistics. In November 2002, the Central Bureau of Statistics, CBS, which is a highly regarded government authority, and nobody really questions the validity of their statistics, produced an article on Arab population growth and density in Israel. The study was conducted in 2001 and compares the Arab population between 1948 and 2001, and the authors also predict the amount of growth in the population by the year 2000. According to the study, in 1948, there were 156,000 Arabs living in Israel. They comprised approximately 19% of the population. By 2020, the population had reached 2 million Arab citizens in Israel, somewhere between 21 to 24% of Israel's population. On average, the proportion of Arabs increased 3.4% by year. So if Israel is conducting genocide, apartheid, and ethnic cleansing, you wouldn't have that kind of population growth in Israel. They're not moving to Israel. They're reproducing, living here, their lives in relative peace. You will see the same statistics for Judea and Samaria amongst the Palestinians. There is no genocide, there is no apartheid, there is no ethnic cleansing. I just want to share with you a small story. A few years ago, when I was involved in public diplomacy, I would take VIPs, American politicians, and interested parties to Barkan, which is an industrial park located outside of Ariel in the Shomron, Samaria. And we would take them because the head of the factory was a kibbutznik who was important to show the world the coexistence in the factory. The factory had about 200 Palestinian workers and maybe another 50, 60 Jewish workers. And what we showed them is that in the factory, there's only one dining hall, there's one bathroom, there's one entrance. All the facilities were equally shared by the Palestinians and the Jewish workers. And the whole accusation of apartheid is such a falsity. All you got to do is look around in Israel and you'll see an Arab judge in the Supreme Court, and you see Arabs integrated in very, very significant industries. And what hasn't been spoken about is the level of integration of Muslims into the IDF. Over the past 3 months, many of them have been killed in action. Only this past week, a Bedouin family in the south lost a father, and a man who had his own family, and the father, who was sitting in the tent mourning for his son, had mentioned to the media that not one Arab Knesset member came to visit to pay final respects for his son. And so the next day, the Prime Minister, Netanyahu, personally went down to that tent to sit with the father and pay his final respects for his son. So in that respect, the level of integration of non-Jews, of Arabs in Israel, I think is way beyond what we would expect, and the claims of genocide, apartheid, ethnic cleansing are simply not true. Okay, let's move on. In addition to Bill Maher, Professor Alan Dershowitz, who also I would consider a neoliberal, said the following the past couple of weeks. I am talking about American Jews who say that killing of 1,200 Israeli Jews was consistent with the Palestinian right to resist, and blamed Israel for the loss of life. He wrote, I am talking about American Jews who proudly use a heroic image of a paraglider, lionizing the Hamas murderers who came into Israel and murdered and tortured their fellow Jews. I am talking about American Jews who call Israelis Nazis and accuse them of acts of genocide, knowing full well and even relishing the hurtfulness of these terms. I am talking about American Jews who question whether the atrocities committed against Jews are accurate, and question whether the October 7th massacre actually happened, or propaganda, and use phrases and terms that sound remarkably like those of Holocaust deniers. I am talking about American Jews who have taken down pictures of Israeli hostages. And he concludes, as much as I would not like to give up on a single Jew, I've given up on them. For me, they are deserving of a harem, formal exclusion from the Jewish people. Okay. In the old days, we all heard the joke, how do you define anti-Semitism? And the answer was, somebody who hates Jews more than is necessary. American Jews did not condone it, but lived with it and even thrived. For the past century, America has been a safe haven for American Jewry, enabling the Jewish community to reach the highest pinnacles of almost all fields of endeavor. Yet with the continuing civil unrest and daily anti-Semitic attacks reaching unprecedented proportions in America, and after October 7th here in Israel, an updated understanding of how the old gentleman's agreement type of anti-Semitism, or somebody who hates Jews more than is necessary, how that classical anti-Semitism has evolved into today's anti-Semitism, namely called redemptive anti-Semitism. You'll see a picture in the notes of a woman who has a big sign that we have to cleanse the world of Jews. And that's a very significant point that she's making, and brings me to what I want to talk about. As we move back to the future, and as Jews are hunted down and attacked violently in broad daylight on the streets of Beverly Hills and Manhattan, all you have to do to understand this new phenomenon is listen to the declarative pronouncements made by these mobs of American Muslims and their cohorts as they viciously attack American Jews arbitrarily. They want these Jews to die. They want to annihilate the Jewish community as a whole. These Muslim Americans and their cohorts will want to kill the Jews with their own bare hands and show their actions to the world through social media. A relatively unknown historical manifestation links together the radical anti-Semitism of the Nazi ideology and the modern-day Jew hatred by radicalized American Muslims. And I don't say this lightly. This common bond of purifying humanity of any Jewish presence, promoted and upheld by radical Islam and the Nazi ideology, now spans more than a 9-decade period. Since its inception, Hamas has openly and consistently declared its determination to annihilate Israel and murder Jews. Their charter quotes a disputed religious ruling stating specifically, Article 8 of their founding charter, the hour of judgment shall not come until the Muslims fight the Jews and kill them, so that the Jew hide behind trees and stones, and each tree and stone will say, O Muslim, O servant of Allah, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him. In the pictures, you'll see a picture of the Mufti of Jerusalem and Adolf Hitler. Hamas's ideology echoes classic European anti-Semitism and Nazi ideology, which incited the genocide of the European Jews. The Hamas terrorists are modern-day torchbearers of Nazism. The common bond of both Hamas and Nazi ideologies is the idea of purifying humanity of any Jewish presence. Nazi ideology exported to the Muslim world their type of anti-Semitism, which is redemptive anti-Semitism, a form of anti-Semitism that promises to redeem the world by exterminating all the Jews. That is, only by annihilating the Jews can humanity be freed. Hamas, with its hour of judgment, embraces exactly the same demented prophecy. The export of redemptive anti-Semitism from Nazi Germany to parts of the Arab world during and after World War II is not merely a supplementary feature of modern radical Islamism, but it is part of its ideological core. All Islamic groups, including Hamas, embrace it, with the results we saw in full on October 7th. Okay, so we heard about what transpired in Israel over the past few months, how it has affected the American Muslim community in America. So you're probably asking yourself, okay, so what can we expect in the coming future? We have to remember that Israel has been here before, which is why that it is safe to say that a political earthquake is on its way. Like all earthquakes, we don't know exactly how it will unfold or when it will hit, but you know it's coming. The colossal catastrophe of October 7th has made a tectonic shift in the country's political landscape, all but certain. Much of what you hear and read is that Netanyahu is guilty and that a revolution at the electoral ballot is just around the corner. All we have to do is go to elections, never mind that elections are 3 years away, never mind that elections will weaken the united political front in combating Hamas, never mind that the overwhelming majority of the public does not want to hear anything about elections at this time and wants the leaders of the nation to focus entirely on finishing Hamas off. I want to remind everyone, in October 1973, Israel faced a similar catastrophe, the Yom Kippur War, which upended society, causing burning anger and frustration. In the elections held just 2 months after the war, the ruling Labor Party alignment of Golda Meir won the elections, but began the downward spiral of being replaced. Israel, still traumatized from the Yom Kippur War and seething from the failures of the government and military leaders in the run-up to the Yom Kippur War, had their say in 1977. Menachem Begin of the Likud party brought up the right-wing government and won, swept Israel with only a few brief left-wing intervals over the years. For most of the past half a century, the right wing has held power in Israel, and that is a result, in my opinion, of the upheaval of the Yom Kippur War. We can expect a similar political scenario in the next elections. That is, the public will vote in a greater right-wing majority, and political parties will present a more right-wing agenda. In a minute, I'll get into what this agenda will look like. But we hear so much that the public will vote in parties that will not include the Likud and all the right-wing parties. And I predict that the very opposite will happen. You will have center-type parties will go and shift rightward because the left is finished in terms of political power, in my opinion, forever, after what happened on October 7th. Now, what can we expect in this near future? First of all, the two-state solution will be a political solution of the past and will not be supported by the majority of Israel electoral makeup. So you might ask yourself, what's the alternative? Any solution that does not endanger the security of the people of Israel and enables Israel to remain a Jewish and democratic nation. That'll be the bottom line. That will be the glue holding together all the political parties that will shift together to the right. I've listed 5 alternatives that I've identified that can bring a possible movement in our relations with the Palestinians and the rest of the nations, the Arab nations surrounding us. I don't know if any of them will be accepted. We might have more of the same, but these are the 5 alternatives that I've identified. First, Israel would assert Israeli law in Judea and Samaria, while Arabs living there would have Israeli residency and Jordanian citizenship. Those Arabs would exercise their democratic rights in Jordan, but live as expatriates with civil rights in Israel. The second alternative, annex Area C. Annexation of only Area C, the territory in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, as defined by the Oslo Accords, which is about 60-70% of the area, where a majority of the 600,000 settlers live, while offering Israeli citizenship to the relatively few Palestinian Arabs living in those areas. But Palestinian Arabs living in areas A and B, the main population centers for Palestinians, would have self-rule. Third option is the Emirate Plan, Palestinian autonomy for 7 non-contiguous emirates in major Arab cities, as well as Gaza, in which he considers equally Israel would annex the rest of the West Bank and offer Israeli citizenship to Arab villages outside these cities. This was a plan, by the way, proposed by Dr. Moti Keidar. It was called the 8-state solution, in which each regional area of a major city would become a nation state. And that is only because the people of those areas have no connection with one another. For example, a Palestinian living in Jenin will not marry a Palestinian living in Hebron. And a Palestinian living in Jericho will not marry a Palestinian living in Ramallah. Different clans, different lines of family, and they really don't have the kind of connection that you would assume they would have. Their families came from different parts of the area. Some families came from Syria, some came from Egypt, some came from the Sinai, some came from Lebanon, some from Iraq. They don't have any connection. So the Emirate plan has had a lot of exposure in recent years. Then you have the one-state solution, which has been promoted by Caroline Glick, the publicist, and she wrote, the contrary to prevailing opinion, Jews are not in danger of losing a demographic majority in Israel. That includes Judea and Samaria. New demographic research shows that thanks to falling Palestinian birth rates and immigration, combined with opposite trends among Jews, a stable Jewish majority of above 60% exists between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, not including Gaza. And this is projected to grow in about 70% by 2059. Ms. Glick thus concludes that the Jewish state is secure. Israel should assert Israeli law in the West Bank and offer Israeli citizenship to its entire Arab population without fear of being outvoted. The fourth possibility is a population exchange. They do not see a resolution of conflicting national aspirations in one land and instead propose an exchange of populations with Arab countries, which effectively expelled about 800,000 Jews around the time of Israeli independence. In contrast, however, the Palestinians in Judea and Samaria would be offered generous compensation to immigrate voluntarily. Those are the 5 alternatives that I've identified in the near future. I think it's pretty obvious what's not on the table right now. Beyond the Palestinian conflict, what else can we foresee in the near future? Despite growing differences between Washington and Jerusalem over the next and final stages of the war and day after scenarios, I think that all Israelis will become deeply appreciative of President Biden's moral leadership and concrete assistance, especially since no Democratic president of the next coming 50 years is likely to be so understanding. Over the course of 2024 and perhaps 2025, 500 kilometers or so of underground terror tunnels will be destroyed in Gaza, following which Israel will have to target Hezbollah's equally dangerous tunnels and bunkers too. Much effort will be made to avoid a major confrontation with Hezbollah. Iran is not ready and willing to allow its major proxy nation in the area to be destroyed, and Israel would prefer to avoid exposing the full array of weapons that she has withheld from using till now, keeping in mind that throughout the war in Gaza, Israel used under 10% of her air force power at any one time, in addition to other technologies that she has not exposed either in Gaza or opposite Hezbollah in the north. Sinwar Hayeh, the head of the Hamas, along with the rest of the leadership of Hamas, will discover that there are no virgins waiting for them in the next world. As for the political scene, the Israeli center will spawn new political parties, all promising unity, togetherness, brotherhood, resilience, and highlight their Jewish, Zionist, and democratic values. These parties will do well, even though their policies relating to the economy, diplomacy, and defense will not differ in any way from those of the Likud, which only strengthens my statement earlier that there will be a shift to the right. Prime Minister Netanyahu will continue as long as he has a majority of Knesset parties that support him. His court cases will either come to a wisely demise on the part of the prosecution and the Attorney General. The judges in his case have already indicated that Netanyahu won't be convicted on bribery. or some sort of solution that won't prevent him from continuing to serve until the next elections. The most depressing development of the coming years lies beyond Israel's border. The astonishing speed in which the genie of global anti-Semitism has come out of the bottle worries me personally more. Physical attacks against highly identifiable Jews have become commonplace, and verbal intellectual assaults against supporters of Israel have become politically correct, even highly regarded. The woke and progressive world have allied themselves with Israel's genocidal enemies. I do want to mention the judicial reform and how it is related to the current period. The very same forces that led the anti-judicial reform are now calling for the following and have restarted mass demonstrations against the government, although the war is far from over. And they've demanded the immediate end of the war at any price and claim that Israel cannot win the war against Hamas. Totally false assumption. The same voices are demanding the release of the hostages at any cost, even if it will bring on a new wave of terror and diminish Israel's future deterrence. The same voices then as now are demanding the immediate resignation of Prime Minister Netanyahu, although immediate elections will weaken Israel as she proceeds and destroys Hamas's capabilities. The same voices then as now are working against the renewed unity that has swept Israel in the past few months. In conclusion, I believe that Israel will emerge stronger and united more than ever. Israeli society is strong, its faith robust, and grit undiminished. I also see a renewed bond and partnership with Jewish communities and non-Jewish communities throughout the world that will strengthen more than ever in the coming year. Okay, that's it.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you very much for your insights and your analysis. I just want to, so if people, I'm sure, have questions, I would just ask that people try to direct their questions to our speaker and let him do the most of the talking.
Will I see them when they ask their question?
They should. You should. So okay. Just unmute yourself if you want to ask a question or raise your hand.
I just want to apologize. I put a lot of stuff in because I felt I had a lot to say, even though the time was limited. So I know it's very dense and quick and all that. So please feel free to ask questions.
Ginny and Fred, did you unmute yourself to ask a question?
I'm happy to ask questions. I see some of my friends on the gallery, and I thank everybody for listening. Ron, I thought that was fabulous. I really appreciate it was a very comprehensive review and a lot of material, which I'm very familiar with because I'm obsessed with all of this. But for a lot of people who are on, maybe don't follow as closely, and I really want to thank you. One thing that I don't think people are aware with this two-state solution, Hamas is not interested in a two-state solution. They want a caliphate, and it's a theocracy. And I wonder if you want to talk about that a little bit.
Well, there's been a lot of talk in recent weeks about the Palestinian Authority regaining control of the Gaza Strip. And so the connection to the two-state solution has to do that they are waiting in the sidelines to see what they get from the Israeli government. And so in a scenario in which the PA would be given control of the Gaza Strip, then they will definitely try to advance the two-state solution. So as far as they're concerned, it's on the table. As far as Israel's concerned and the public of Israel, it's not on the table. Nobody will be willing to trust the security of the state of Israel to any foreign Arabs, and Israel will continue full military control, not only of the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria, but also of Gaza. Israel will not relinquish security control of the Gaza Strip for the foreseeable future.
Ron, I think, at least I understood Judy's question to be more about, what is Hamas's goal, which I think what Judy's pointing out is that the misconception that Hamas is interested in a two-state solution when they're interested in just a one state.
Yeah, we saw on October 7th what they're interested in. They're not interested in a political solution. As far as they're concerned, there's only one solution: to liquidate Israel. They have no other solution. The two-state solution has been spoken about, and it will affect the Gaza Strip should it be promoted. But I don't see it going anywhere. The Hamas says it won't be an organization any longer. It will be eliminated. It will be destroyed, politically and militarily.
Thank you for that clarification. Other questions? You have to unmute yourself or raise your hand, or just you can wave and I can unmute you if you. Oh, okay, Ginny. Hold on, I gotta find you. There you are, Ginny. Go ahead, unmute yourself.
Why would Israel be opposed to having a pause to get the hostages back?
I didn't hear you. Why would Israel be opposed to?
Is Israel opposed to having a pause to get the hostages back? Why not do that?
The only way of getting the hostages back is by military pressure. You have to appreciate that the head of Hamas is holding the hostages as human shields. And one of the reasons that Israel changed its fighting tactics about a month ago had to do with the fact that they've already gotten very close to them, and they can't use heavy firepower without killing the hostages as well. So the Hamas will not release them unless they have no choice. And bring them to the point of having no choice is having the army close in on them. They will not negotiate. Only today, Hamas gave the response that they will only be willing to negotiate the release of the hostages if Israel stops the war. And Israel will not stop the war. Now, at the first round of hostage releases, I think it was like a month and a half ago or 2 months ago, the only reason that it was agreed upon is that Hamas thought that because of the break in fighting, Israel will not renew the fighting because of public pressure. But Israel, in fact, did renew the fighting and completed the control of all of the Gaza Strip. And so he understands now that it won't work to ask for a temporary ceasefire. He wants the war to stop, and Israel will not stop the war. If Israel stops the war, then we'll see this kind of threat coming from all the directions. So only by getting close with military forces and cornering them will there be any chance of releasing the hostages. The other thing is, today what we also heard in the news that at least a quarter of the hostages being held are no longer alive. In my opinion, it's a much higher rate. Officially, there are 136 hostages. And so today they said a quarter of them are not alive any longer. Unfortunately, we'll see that it'll go way higher.
Ron, can you just unpack that further, the point about that in Israel's estimation, it's not just fighting against Hamas, but also advancing its deterrent capability by, against other enemies that are arrayed against it?
The Middle East is a very dangerous environment. Everybody looks on one another, and everybody has also the relationships with different countries. In this part of the world, Israel has always held a military superiority above its neighbors. We haven't lost the war, and we have never been confronted with a situation such as October 7th. Even the Yom Kippur War, which started very bad, ended with the Israeli army just outside of Cairo. In the north, Israel ended the war just outside of Damascus. So in this part of the world, you have to remain strong and being perceived as strong. It was 2 years ago 3 years ago that the Abraham Accords were signed, in which Arab nations like Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and others, and Morocco, signed an agreement with Israel a regional agreement to promote all sorts of common interests. And they did so because they perceived Israel as being the strongest power in the Middle East, a regional superpower. And to maintain that perception, you have to create a deterrence. By eliminating Hamas and eliminating its deterrence, its leadership, you show to the world, in this part of the world, that you can't mess with Israel without paying a price. And that's the price that we're going to have to show to all the other nations in our area. If not, you will see a collapse. And I say this not lightly. You have peace agreements with Egypt, you have peace agreement with Jordan. You might very well see a collapse of those agreements too, if they sense that Israel is not willing to go all the way to retain its deterrence. So in that respect, I don't think that Israel really has a choice here, despite all the voices being said concerning stopping the war immediately. Israel has no choice here, and it doesn't matter who you ask. You could ask Benny Gantz, or you could ask Netanyahu. Israel doesn't have a choice here.
Suzanne, you had indicated you had typed that you wanted to ask a question.
I appreciate this very much. Perhaps you touched on it and I missed it. I'm involved with the United Nations and, in fact, with the committee, a new NGO committee to end anti-Semitism and promote peace. I'm sure all of you are following, what is going on with UNRWA, et cetera, et cetera. I will tell you my biggest fear, and I don't think you touched on that, and that is Israel being called before the International Court of Justice. And the fact that the United Nations brought Israel into existence by voting in favor, could they not, and they certainly have the votes, to vote Israel out of existence? And I understand the role of the United States always protecting Israel, but frankly, I'm not as certain as I once was that they would always do that. So I would like to know your comments and position on what role you think the United Nations will play in all of this.
Well, the court at Hague made a decision without making a decision. They called for an end of the fighting, but they didn't sanction Israel, as far as I know, and they didn't create any kind of operational decisions that will alter or affect Israel's standing in the UN. I think that that's the best that we could hope for at this point in time. Israel had the choice of not sending a representation to The Hague, but the government decided to send a representation, and that representation disproved all of the allegations of South Africa concerning genocide. So in a world that it's far from perfect, and in a world that doesn't stand up to condemn Hamas for the murder of children, I think that we came out of the process that we saw 2 weeks ago relatively in a decent state. More than that, I really don't have much to say about the UN. I'm not up to date with what's going on there. But I just want to say that the fact that UNICEF and Save the Children, which are organizations dedicated to protecting children throughout the world, have been silent, and nobody's really taken them to task for that.
Right.
Nobody's on the offensive against them. They've let them just go by, and it's a shame. And this would be an opportunity to leverage accusations against them that aren't being done.
Correct. I agree.
Susan,
I'm sorry, it's not just the Hague, it's also the General Assembly. Okay, and so that's where it really is potentially very dangerous.
I'm not up to date, but from what I hear in terms of news, and I'm pretty much I have to gather a lot of resource information for articles that I write. I don't see that happening in the near future. I don't see that happening.
Let's Susan Holtzman and then Stuart Hirschon. Okay, we'll go in that order. I see your hands. I'm trying to call on everybody. You have to unmute yourself.
In your opinion, why was Israel so unprepared for the attack on October 7th?
Okay, I will try to be here objective and not get into politics, but it's a problematic question. The army, the same army, the same policymakers in the security branches that promoted the 2005 disengagement from the Gaza Strip, the same military minds that promoted the unilateral withdrawal from Lebanon in 1999. This mindset, I don't want to use the word deep state, but this mindset of basing the army on technology and making the army small and smart, as Ehud Barak said, has gone bankrupt. And this conception of placing technology on the border with Hamas went bankrupt. And so the army has had to revise its thinking about security and how do you maintain security. In recent years, the army invested greater and greater amounts of budgetary funding on the Air Force and missile technology, and much less on ground forces and the nuts and bolts of holding an army. And so one of the outcomes of that change in the division of power, in taking large amounts of money from the ground forces and putting them in new technologies, in Air Force, in missile technology, has created the kind of myopic preparation that we saw. And so I think that the Army understands that now, and they will make the necessary changes in the coming years, but it's a problem. It's going to cost a lot of money. You're going to have to increase the size of the Army. You have to increase the size of land forces. So a big transformation is above us. And I think that many of those military minds that were part of this conception will no longer be around, because what they thought has shown to be a strategic threat to the state of Israel. And that's how it happened. I don't want to get into names of officers and positions and who did what. That will come out in the commission of inquiry after the war. But it's very obvious here that those in charge didn't understand and couldn't write the battlefield before them. And so it happens. It happens. The thing is that, and you have to appreciate that even when Israel makes a mistake, like they did in Yom Kippur, and they did on October 7th, we're able to regroup and within a relatively short period of time, overcome the damage of the misconception. And that's what happened here, more or less, at a very high price. At a very high price of 1,200 civilians in kibbutzim and moshavim and small towns, innocent people had to go through such a vicious event. But it will change, and what was will no longer be. And that's a very important line we have to remember. What was will no longer be.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Stuart?
Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you for your talk. I really appreciate your thoughts and your effort that went into it. I'd like to ask you a couple of questions and follow up on the last question too. During the roll-up until the war, we were in Israel in May, and I was in the United States Navy. I was shocked when I saw what was happening in Israel, when I realized that reservists and some active duty people were not responding and not going to work in the military. I was shocked by that. And I know that you can't have an effective military with people who don't obey orders and don't go to work. And I'd like to know if you think that that had anything to do with this catastrophe of October 7th, where people were just not prepared for a lot of reasons, but one of them being this, in my opinion, unconscionable business about people saying they're not going to report for duty. That bothered me a lot.
Can I just answer that question before you get to the second question?
Sure.
The insubordination that preceded October 7th that we saw during the anti-judicial demonstrations in which pilots and all sorts of military personnel claimed to refuse to serve had nothing to do with the catastrophe of October 7th. It did not contribute to the failure of the military to respond. In fact, you have only one case of one soldier who refused to serve during the period preceding October 7th. Everything else was media hype. Only one soldier, despite all the many reports.
Small bills. You can't get these bills. All right.
That in itself did not contribute in any way, but the idea that the officers, senior officers in charge of the army, did not respond to the insubordination tells you something about the level of condescension they had for defending the state of Israel. They thought, oh, we'll let them say what they want and do what they want. And they couldn't imagine that the Arabs on the other side, Hamas, actually believed that the army will not come on the day that it needs. They believed all that because it was highly publicized on all the media everywhere that soldiers are refusing to serve, pilots are refusing to serve. And in that way, it was part of the mindset of Hamas and its leadership to go and attack Israel. But it had nothing to do with our failure in protecting Israel from that attack.
Okay, thank you thanks for the answer. I was curious about that. The other thing I'd like you to comment about is some couple of thoughts I have, and I'll try to make it brief. One is what some people say is the predictable outcome after this war about what's going to happen politically. What fascinates me is in the United States, for instance, a lot of people forget or don't know, the United States had 3 colossal intelligence failures. Pearl Harbor, the Battle of the Bulge. 20,000 Americans lost their lives in the Battle of the Bulge in World War II because of intelligence failure. Eisenhower and Bradley were responsible for that. They didn't lose their jobs. In fact, Eisenhower became president. And then we have George Bush, 2011. So political leaders don't necessarily lose their jobs, depending on what the population and what the politics are within the country. But Israelis are not alone in having these failures. We've had big ones here. The other thing I'm curious about, and I'd like your thoughts about, is the word occupation. It fascinates me. After World War II, the United States and Great Britain, Russia, and France occupied Germany for at least 5 years or more. Same thing in Japan. The United States occupied Japan. The reason they occupied these countries was they had to stay there until the ideology, both the Nazi ideology and the Bushido ideology in Japan, were eliminated. Otherwise, they'd still be there. Israel has the same problem. Fortunately, the United States and the 4 powers were able to accomplish this within a very relatively short period of time. Israel cannot, so far, do this, and I don't see a solution until this ideology is eradicated to the extent where Israel can exist peaceably. What are your thoughts about that? And why doesn't Israel make the point that the occupation is about getting rid of the ideology so that they can coexist in peace? I think for some reason this is a bad PR issue for Israel.
Well, first of all, I agree that we are very bad at propaganda and PR. It's just not I think it's not in our DNA. Even though Madison Avenue was established by Jews, I don't know why we're so bad at it. But we haven't developed the proper mindset to really deal with it on a serious level. But maybe now we will. But concerning the military failure, you should know that in recent weeks, there have been many, many, many reports of intelligence being collected accurately, predicting what will happen the weekend of Simchas Torah. And the problem was not that they didn't collect the right intelligence. The problem that it was ignored by the senior intelligence officers of the IDF. And that's the problem. There are many, many accounts, many of the soldiers, primarily women soldiers, that were stationed on the fence in listening posts, reported what will happen and what is happening online in real time, and it was ignored by the senior military officers who said it doesn't mean that they're going to attack. It doesn't mean that they're going to attack. So the intelligence failure was not so much in the collecting of the intelligence material, but in terms of doing something with it. And again, those officers, in my opinion, will be gone soon enough. We'll have a new generation of intelligence officers which will listen to their very own soldiers sitting on the front lines. So that in terms of military failure. In terms of the term occupation, it's almost a given that Israel is an occupying power. And it's very difficult to undo over 50 years of this claim. Now, the legal status of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, is that it is disputed territory, not occupied territory. It is disputed territory. Legally, you do not occupy disputed territory. But it really doesn't matter. It's occupied as far as the world is concerned, and I doubt that will change in the near future. However, because we're not able to arrive to a mutual agreement with the Palestinians, this can continue for an extended period of time, or one of the alternatives that I brought up might click in. So I don't think it's an issue that will be changed, and Israel will have to live with the false accusation, of her being an occupying power.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Roz, you can unmute yourself.
I'm sorry?
Roz Case.
All right, I'm speaking with Roz. We were wondering, in the future, since Iran is really behind all of this unrest and war, does Israel have any plans to punish Iran for some of this?
Well, let me put it this way. Israel has the ability to punish Iran extensively, in the same way that it has the ability to punish Lebanon and Hezbollah extensively. What we saw in the Gaza Strip, in which 50 to 60% of it has been destroyed, and it will take years and years and years to rebuild the Gaza Strip. There's nothing left there. It's almost totally destroyed. I think that's what you can expect Israel to do in Lebanon, and to start, and to a large extent, the possibilities in terms of Iran. I don't think that that's in the foreseeable future. I think one of the reasons that we don't see this, or will see this, in the foreseeable future is because of the need to develop new technologies. For example, Lebanon could fire on Israel, Hezbollah I mean, between 3,000 to 4,000 missiles and rockets per day. They have over 200,000 missiles and rockets. Now, the current technology, as far as I know, cannot deal with that level of missile attacks. The new technologies that are emerging, laser technologies, can deal with that threat. And I think it's just a question of time before Israel will have operational systems to deal with that level of threat. And when that happens, then you might have a greater possibility of the need to attack Iran in the way that you're suggesting. The other thing is that, and I mentioned that in my notes, is that Israel has to be very careful not to expose what technologies she does in fact have. And so you gotta leave it on the side for when you have no choice. And also that's one of the considerations for not dealing with Iran right now.
Thank you. There are other questions?
I
can't
hope
really
I answered
see.
that question. I hope I answered the question.
I think so.
Okay.
Okay, Ron, why don't we give you Ron, why don't we
Suzanne
give
is-
you
Suzanne
what's
is
that?
waving her hand.
Oh, I can't see. I'm sorry.
Suzanne, you have to unmute.
I didn't
I'm
see
sorry
that.
to be such a pain, but everybody knows that Iran is very close to having nuclear grade weapons. What do you think the chances are of them getting it and using it? And where does that leave Israel?
Well, the whole idea of nuclear technology is not only based on gaining enrichment of material, but it's developing the system, the bomb itself, and then developing a system to carry that bomb elsewhere and have it explode in the way that you want. And from the reports that I have read, they don't have that full technology yet. Even if they're able to develop enrichment and create the necessary material they need for the bomb itself, between that point of time and the actual ability to send that somewhere in a dependable platform, I think they're still not there. And I think that behind the scenes, Israel is doing what it knows how to do to slow them down. I remember even 20 years ago, the reports were that Iran is on the verge of a nuclear missile, and that was 20 years ago. So I think that in that respect, the greater pressure that Israel puts on the regional countries here will serve that interest. And I think that's the best we can say at this point.
Thank you.
By the way, you might have a change in Iran. Iran was an ally of Israel many years ago until the Carter administration.
Mhm.
Things might change. Who knows? The change might come from within. It's a country of 80 million people. And so they might very well send the Ayatollahs home and bring in a whole new regime that will think differently in terms of how they see Israel. The Iranian people, for the most part, support Israel. So you never know where it comes from.
It's true.
Ron, why don't you offer us a closing word, and then Judy can offer some concluding thanks.
Okay. Well, I'm very happy to share what's going on here, and I'm very happy and satisfied to see the level of interest for you guys in America. I think that October 7th will be a milestone in relationship between Israel and American Jewry. I see the closeness just bubbling to the surface as a result. I think we see a common threat, a common sense of having to work together to deal with this situation. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to connect to you guys.
Thank you. Judy?
Yeah, well, Ron, I really treasure that we've had this connection since you first spoke at Lador Vador, and I can't thank you enough. I thank everybody who participated, because this is dense stuff and it's hard. But I think your message about that Israel's never been more united. I think one thing we were doing programming on UNRWA. We didn't even talk about UNRWA, and Suzanne is involved, and we know people who've been working on UNRWA, and until this horrific attack, which forced the Israeli military to go in and get the hard evidence that they were UNRWA. We knew this. I mean, we knew that the hatred that's being taught and the sheltering of bombs and missiles, all of it. But UNRWA now, on all these things that I've been focusing on the front pages, and it's the focus of the news. And people, no matter how many times they heard UNRWA, they didn't really understand what it was. But maybe, it's coming to light, and maybe there'll be some action. And I think the big topic for me, which has always been it's the universities and this horrific response on the highest levels of most elite universities in America and on down. A big part of that, which needs to come to the surface, are the foreign students. What happened at Harvard, I know from class A of my husband's, who's still involved, and he was the head of the business school. Those participate, they were Muslims. I mean, these were Muslim students. And I think another thing, which I would love to do a program on, across the United States, Memory has been doing focusing on sermons coming out of mosques across America. Never a word of sympathy, ever. Even these mosques that had like ICLI on Long Island, programming with Jewish supporters, not a word. And I think the Jewish community has to wake up to what's going on. And Israel's in a very difficult situation because they can't really talk about it because they're negotiating with Muslim countries. You want to encourage Muslims to embrace a more liberal approach, which includes getting along with their neighbors. So anyway, I just want to thank Ron again, and thank you, Rabbi Moskowitz, so much for allowing us to do this program and for helping me get it done.
So thank you again, Judy, for your leadership, and for the Enrichment Committee, and Ron Jager especially for staying up until the wee hours of the morning there in Israel and sharing with us what's going on there in Israel and how everybody's feeling.